People would raise their hand to him and say, live long and prosper. And he always enjoyed the fact that throughout the world, people were doing this gesture without realizing that what they were doing was blessing each other.
This is the Book of Life. I'm Heidi Rabinowitz. Because he writes so many great books, Rich Michelson has been a guest on the Book of Life before. He was here in 2007 to talk about his baseball book, Across the Alley. In 2009, he was on in February to discuss his picture book biography of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. and Abraham Joshua Heschel called As Good as Anybody. And he was back on the podcast that December, taking part in a kidlit discussion in the Planet Esme reading room. I'll put links to all these past conversations in the show notes at bookoflifepodcast.com so you can enjoy them again. Now, Rich has written a picture book biography about his good friend Leonard Nimoy, the Jewish actor famous for playing Mr. Spock on Star Trek. Quite logically, the title is Fascinating. I spoke to Rich by phone at his home in Massachusetts, but before we hear from Rich, let's listen to Leonard Nimoy reciting Hamlet's soliloquy in Yiddish, courtesy of the Yiddish Book Center's Wexler Oral History Project.
Sein oder nicht sein? Oder was ist die Frage? Es ist edler von Gemüt vertrocknen still der schleiderstehenden Pfeil von Beusen Masel oder sich bewaffnen an Kegenjam von Leid und endigen den Kampf. Hamlet.
So, Rich, welcome to the Book of Life.
Thank you, Heidi. It's been a while.
Yes, it's great to talk to you. We're going to talk about your new picture book biography of Leonard Nimoy called Fascinating. And I wanted to start by sharing a personal story.
Great.
I don't know if you remember this, but a number of years ago, I was at the Book Expo Publishing Convention with our mutual friend, Etta Gold, who's another librarian like me. And Etta and I spotted you on the showroom floor walking along with a friend, and we were all excited to see you. So we yelled, Rich, and we ran up to you. And after a minute of exchanging greetings, you said, oh, and I'd like you to meet my friend, Leonard Nimoy. And I think my jaw just dropped to the floor. I probably wasn't even able to say anything. But I think you were tickled pink because in this case, you were the superstar that people were running after instead of him. So
that happened once with me and Leonard at dinner because we had many dinners and lunches together. And he was always so generous with folks, but they were always coming up and talking to him and asking for an autograph. But actually once when we were out to dinner, somebody approached the table, walked right over to me and said, are you Rich Michelson? And I said, I am. And they said, oh, I love your books. And we chatted for a few minutes. And as they turned to go, they saw Leonard and they said, oh, and is that your dad? And I said, it is. And they turned to him and they said, you must be so proud of your son. And Leonard said, I'm very proud of him, yes. And I would remind Leonard of that story on a fairly regular basis. And I remember telling him, don't worry, if you hang out with me long enough, people will start to recognize you too. So yes, that's always fun when that happens.
That's great. And you do have a lot of facial similarity.
Well, you know, this has always been kind of a fun thing for Leonard and I. The question I get asked more than anything is, are you Leonard Nimoy's son? And I always say no, and then people don't believe me anyways. Occasionally it comes in very handy. If I can't get a restaurant booking in New York City to a place I want to go to, I have been known to call up and make a reservation for myself and my dad, the Leonard Nimoy. And when I get there, once they sit me, I say, I'm sorry, but I just heard from my dad he can't make it, but I do have a friend who's joining me. And then there's great consternation. They don't know what to do, but I look enough like him that it works every time. It's going to be harder now, unfortunately.
Yeah.
But what can you do?
Right. So let's cover the basics of the life of Leonard Nimoy.
Well, my book is primarily the young Leonard Nimoy. He grew up in the West End of Boston. He was the son of an Orthodox home, 3 sets of dishes. His parents both immigrated from Zavlev, Ukraine, in front of pogroms. His mother was smuggled out in a hay cart. His dad walked for days to sneak across the border. And Leonard grew up in a small apartment in West End, Boston, 3 generations of Nimoys in a tiny little apartment. His grandmother spoke Yiddish and never learned to speak English. His grandfather was also there. He was Leonard's hero. What's often the case with people who immigrate and are escaping pogroms is you tend to have one or two attitudes. In his parents' case, they were very fearful throughout his growing up. They wanted him home early. They always wanted to know what he was doing. It was a fairly typical way of saying, don't make waves, keep your head down. You don't know what tomorrow is going to bring, so be very careful. And his grandparents, under the similar circumstances, took the opposite approach. You don't know what's coming tomorrow, so live for today. His grandfather always told him, go, do, explore, try new things. So that's the home he grew up in. My book is him as a 8-year-old boy in Temple when he first saw the Hebraic blessing, which he was to later make world famous as the Vulcan hand salute. And the book ends in the 2nd season of Star Trek when we first visit the planet Vulcan, and the script said for Leonard to greet the Vulcan Queen and go up and shake her hand. And Leonard thought that there should be a different greeting. He said, military men salute, Asians bow, Vulcans should do something different. They shouldn't just shake hands. And the director said, okay, what should they do? And he hadn't quite thought that far in advance. Mm-hmm. He didn't have anything in mind. And all of a sudden, it came to him this moment as an 8-year-old boy when the elders went to the bema and he was told by his father, don't look. And like any 8-year-old boy, he peeked and he saw them pull the prayer shawls over their heads and raise their hands in what is now a fairly famous gesture. They spread their fingers into what looked like a shin, which is, of course, the first letter of shalom, or peace, or Shaddai, one of the names for God, as I mentioned in the book. And Leonard raised his hand, and that became the blessing. A funny story outside of this is what he said he hadn't counted on was this is a gesture that he had been enthralled with, and he'd practiced it in his room for many years as a child, so he could do it instantaneously with each hand. But he forgot that the rest of the cast and crew hadn't practiced it as well. So he raised his hand, but some of them had to kind of go backstage and get their fingers taped before they did the same. So that's the span of the book. Leonard mentioned that he knew immediately after the show aired that he had struck a nerve. He walked down the street right after that show aired, and people would raise their hand to him and say, live long and prosper. And he always enjoyed the fact that throughout the world, people were doing this gesture without realizing that what they were doing was blessing each other. And he loved that idea. That's the span of the book. Within there, we talk a lot about his upbringing, how he first acted, his love of photography, which was very important to him. He got his first camera as a very young man when he was 12, 13 years old, and he still had that camera till the day he died. And the very first picture he took was of his grandfather. And it became his passion, frankly, throughout his life. Many people don't realize that when Star Trek went off the air after 3 seasons, Leonard seriously considered leaving the business and becoming a professional photographer. He went back to school to UCLA to study photography, and it's something he did throughout his life. And, of course, that was the impetus for us having a long relationship because, as you know, I'm an art dealer, and I ended up handling Leonard's photography career. And in the many years that we traveled together to various shows, to going to museums, etc., our relationship formed. We were very, very close. We communicated daily for the last 10 years of his life, and he became, a mentor and close friend to me.
A detail that I wanted to follow up on.
Mm-hmm.
So Leonard Nimoy created the Live Long and Prosper sign. Did he also create the phrase Live Long and Prosper, or was that in the script?
He did not, no. That phrase was actually written in the script by Theodore Sturgeon in the episode Amok Time.
Mm-hmm.
I think people don't realize often how much Leonard background he brought to the role. His sense of an outsider. There's so much of himself in Spock. And I think that's why so many people really relate to it. They really get a sense that it's not an act, even though he's acting. They get a sense of the humanity behind that. So many of Leonard's values came out through Spock. Throughout his life, he was definitely a supermensch. The Jewish values were important to him. He stood up for what he felt was right. He often argued for the rest of the cast. He made sure that the other characters received the same salaries that he did per episode. When the cartoon version was aired, they only wanted to hire him and Shatner to save money. He said unless the rest of the cast were included, he would not do it. Throughout his life, many Jewish causes were important to him. He spoke out for what he believed in, put his money to causes. He helped many young artists. He really was a wonderful, wonderful man, and being with him was an inspiration for me.
What will you miss most about him?
I'll miss so much, but his presence. I'll miss our daily talks, but, he's still with us. In my gallery right now, we're having a exhibition of his photography. We're also selling off some of his camera collection to raise money for COPD research. In his spirit, I think he would appreciate that. The last conversation that Leonard and I had was about this book. He did get to read it before he passed on. Thanksgiving morning in 2014, I finished the manuscript. I read it over, and I knew that I had what I wanted, and I knew it was really a book that I was happy with. So I sent it to Leonard, and as was his wont, he replied almost immediately, said, "I'm so glad that you did this. I'm flattered. Thank you very much." That to me, I'm glad I didn't wait. So to everybody who's listening to this podcast who are writers, and you have something you want to write, sit down and do it today, because you never know if you put it off what's going to happen in the meantime. I'm so glad that I did this. When I wrote it, I had absolutely no idea that he would pass away 3 months later. I obviously knew he had been ill, but he'd been ill for some time, even though the public didn't know. We were very aware of that. And he was Leonard Nimoy. We figured he would master everything. Mm-hmm. His attitude was always totally optimistic. Sunshine followed him. He had a wonderful way of looking at life. But as we know, he did pass away that February. And the last thing I said to him was, "You have to get better, because we've got a big book tour coming up." And the last words he said to me were, "Don't worry, Rich, I'll be there with you." Mm-hmm. In many ways he is, but he's left so much wonderful behind that it's a mixed blessing. We should all go the way he did, surrounded by family, having achieved what he wanted to achieve, with a smile.
Mm-hmm. Now, this is a very concise biography. Why did you decide to do a picture book biography rather than something more detailed?
Primarily because, number one, that's mostly what I do. Mm-hmm. That's how I think. As you know, I'm also a poet, and I don't do a lot of long form. I do write essays, but picture books to me are very close to writing poetry. It's finding that right word. It's chiseling down to get to the essentials. That's what I wanted to do. Also, I wanted to have a book that parents could read to their children, that young kids could read, in a sense, to introduce him to the next generation. He has written his own couple of biographies. The first one, famously titled "I Am Not Spock," followed 20-something years later with another biography called "I Am Spock." Mm-hmm. William Shatner wrote a story of their friendship in Star Trek. So much has been written about his Star Trek years, and he spoke about it so much. but very little is known about his early life. And that's a form that I gravitate to. I think it's an absolute wonderful form. And I sell as many picture books to adults as I do to children. Mm-hmm. I think it's, for many people, a guilty pleasure that should not be a guilty pleasure. And even now, for me, when I want to learn about a subject, the first thing I do is I go to children's books, because I sense that if the author and illustrator have really done their job and it's a good book, they're really going to get the essentials to me and give me a broad sense of the subject. And then if I want to delve further, I can delve further. But it gives me a sense of what I need to know. So I'm in love with picture books.
So am I, actually.
Yeah, I know.
That's why we get along so well.
Yeah, and for me, also, I'm an art dealer, and visual is very important to me. The loves of my life are visual art and poetry, and a picture book combines the two of them. I mean, what a great form. It can't be improved upon.
Well said. And actually, I was just about to ask you about something visual. Mm-hmm. Can you talk about Leonard Nimoy's photography? What sort of photography did he do?
Anybody who's listening, the easiest thing is you can go on leonardnimoyphotography.com, and you'll get a good sense of his photographs. Leonard is what you call a conceptual photographer. He's not somebody who carries a camera around and just snaps pictures when he sees something. He comes up with an idea and then figures out how to explore that idea in visual terms, in photographic terms. So when he first started as a photographer, certainly through his teens and as a young man and a young actor, he did carry a camera around, and he took wonderful pictures. He has an amazing eye. As you know, he directed some great grossing movies and, of course, the better of the Star Trek films. He's got a great visual sense. He loved primarily black and white until the very end of his career. So he did start out taking photos just when he saw something that fascinated him. Oh, there's that word. When he was traveling on movie sets or in theater sets, if he saw an old barn or a field that he just loved, he would capture that, and there's great emotion in those. But his more serious work later on was after he went to UCLA. He studied with a photographer called Robert Heineken, who was also a conceptual artist, and would say, if you're walking down the street with your camera and you see somebody jumping out a window and you snap a photograph, that's not art. And he always insisted that if he were walking down that street, he would not take that picture. But if you're trying to understand falling bodies or motion and you're doing a study of that, then you take that photograph. So this comes back to Leonard as an 8-year-old boy. After he did the famous Vulcan hand greeting, he learned as an adult why his father had told him to look away when he was a boy. And the reason was, when this particular prayer is given, and everybody covers their head with their prayer shawls, it's because the Shekinah, which is the feminine aspect of God, is entering the temple. And if you look, you're likely to be blinded by the beauty. So Leonard had been taking a number of photographs of nudes, of dancers, working with the contrasts and the black and white, and they're gorgeous. But he started thinking about, well, why am I taking these photographs? What are they really about? And he decided that he was trying to express his view of the feminine aspect of God. And with that in mind, he did what became our first show here at the gallery, and a fairly well-known book called Shekinah. It is beautiful black and white photographs, primarily of naked women draped in prayer shawls, wearing phylacteries, and, as you know, not accoutrements usually worn by women. And Leonard decided that what he was exploring was the relationship between sexuality and religion. It's a beautiful exhibit, beautiful photographs. He certainly got some blowback when we toured the country. Many synagogues, many museums invite him to speak. Many of them rescinded the invitation when they saw what they were showing. On the other hand, I have to say that in just about every town where he was disinvited, there was another synagogue that invited him. Mm-hmm. And many rabbis who said wonderful things about the project. It was really a great exploration for him. And that led to his next project, which was the Full Body Project, a book of photographs of what we would call Zoftig women. And what happened was at one of his Shekinah shows, a very heavy woman came up to Leonard, well over 300 pounds, and asked him why his vision of Jewish female beauty was so similar to the prevailing Western civilization's notion of beauty. And Leonard thought about that. And he realized that he was in an industry that probably did more than any other industry to push an unrealistic image on women. He decided to show the beauty of all women. And this is an amazing book called The Full Body Project and a series of photographs, many based on well-known paintings such as Matisse's Dancers, which he recreated with these very large women, some very famous photographs by Helmut Newton and others, where he recreated some of these supermodel photographs with his current models. He ended up hiring a burlesque troupe called the Fat Bottom Review to do some of these. And he did it with dignity and beauty. And he became a champion to many women for standing up for that. Another project that he did here called Secret Selves, which was filmed in this gallery, was when he was reading about a Greek myth that said humans used to have 4 arms and 4 legs and 2 heads, and we got so powerful that Zeus sent a thunderbolt and split us all in 2. And hence, that's why human angst and unhappiness has come into the world, because we spend our entire lives searching for our other halves to make us whole. And he photographed people's other halves for them. And again, it was a very moving project. And many other things, another book called Eye Contact. I'm showing now photographs called Unseen in honor of the 50th anniversary of Trek. We are exhibiting 50 photographs that he took throughout his lifetime that have never previously been shown. So that gives you a general sense. He was a great photographer, and he's in many, many museums around the country. When I first showed Leonard's work, frankly, we did so under an assumed name because we did not want the celebrity to get in the way with people's appreciation of these photographs. And Leonard was never so happy as when we sold photographs to people who had no idea who had taken them. But eventually he became respected by photographers in museums around the country and who realized he was not a dilettante at this. He took it seriously.
Mm-hmm. Now, I've heard that Leonard's son Adam is creating a documentary about his life. Were you involved in that project at all?
I'm not involved in that project other than that Adam and I are friends, and his movie and my book premiered within a day of each other. We were both at the Mission 50 Star Trek convention in New York, and that started out also when Leonard was alive. It was just going to be a documentary about Spock's influence on our culture today, but after Leonard passed, Adam decided to make it a little bit more about his life. I should mention that Leonard's daughter, Julie, is also doing a documentary called Highly Illogical. That will be out, I believe, in November, and it is to raise awareness for COPD prevention.
All right.
When people found out that he was dying of COPD, he decided, again, to turn that to the good, and to try to raise awareness. He had been in his youth a very, very heavy smoker, but he hadn't had a cigarette in over 30 years. The damage had been done, however, and that is what finally slowed him down and took his life.
So we've talked about so many different things. Is there anything else you'd like to talk about that I haven't thought to ask you?
We should mention that the illustrations are by Errol Rodriguez. When Errol was hired to do the book, I was familiar with his non-illustration work, his graphic designs, his work for Time, Newsweek, most of the major magazines, New Yorker, I loved. It was not until after Errol turned in his work that I found out, in fact, that he had come to this country on a Cuban boat lift and, in fact, learned to speak English by listening to old Star Trek episodes. How cool is that?
Wonderful.
Yeah, that's another wonder for this book of Leonard bringing people together.
That's great. Rich Michelson, thanks so much for speaking with us, and live long and prosper.
Thank you, Heidi, and to you and everyone who's listening, I wish the same.
If you enjoy the Book of Life podcast, please become a patron at patreon.com/Book of Life. Leave a review on iTunes or a comment on our blog at bookoflifepodcast.com. You can also like our page at facebook.com/Book of Life podcast. Follow us at twitter.com/bookoflifepod. Email us at bookoflifepodcast@gmail.com or leave us a voicemail at 561-206-2473. The Book of Life is a podcast service of the Feldman Library at Congregation B'nai Israel in Boca Raton, Florida at cbiboca.org and is supported in part by the Association of Jewish Libraries at jewishlibraries.org. Our background music is provided by the Freilach Makers Klezmer String Band. Thanks for listening and happy reading.